Information about the world of running, inspiration to fuel passion and excellence, and ideas for making connections and finding community. You're listening to A to Z Running. Hey everyone, welcome back to the A to Z Running Podcast, where we help runners thrive. I'm Andi.
And I am Zach, and this week we respond to listener questions covering topics and questions about tune-up races, routines, training priorities, and more. And stick around after that for the latest from the world of running, including a new fastest marathon debut, outdoor track season heating up, and a world record attempt. And to find out how that went, you're going to need to keep listening. Now remember, the most important thing that you should be doing right now, if you haven't already, is going to AtoZrunning.com to click the word follow, because it's free, and then you won't miss any of the great stuff.
Yeah. And one of the places we like to post content is Instagram. And I had the privilege of meeting one of our listeners, Liz, at Rivertown Races. And it was great to be able to actually see her in real life. So if you see us at races or events, feel free to come on over and say hi. We'd love to meet you. Well, that wasn't all about Liz, because she also listened to the episode about glutes last week, and she posted on Instagram, as I was running this weekend, my legs would get tired and I would think to myself, are my glutes firing properly, or am I making my hamstrings do the work? It's amazing how the physical change I could feel just by being conscious of which muscles I should be using. So thank you, Liz, for that comment on Instagram. And then I'm so glad that you found last week's episode with Betsy really helpful. That's all about glutes. So if you haven't listened, feel free to go on back. And again, congratulations to Liz on her PR. It was a 19-minute half marathon PR at Rivertown Races. So extra congrats and shout out to you.
Impressive stuff for sure. That's great. And good to chat with you.
Mm-hmm. Now remember, if you have any questions about training or anything related to running, from A to Z, send them our way to AtoZrunning.com, and we'll feature it next time. So this episode is all about the things that you ask and want to know about running.
Let's get started. As noted, questions from all of you. This is our favorite thing to do, so keep those questions coming. We love answering them. And I just thought, well, you might not like our answers, but that's okay. You don't have to like them. We just enjoy it. All right. So from Mark in Michigan, this was a great question, and I was glad for a chance to respond to him in email as well, but wanted to lay out the details for you all here and respond as well. So the question involves a fair bit of context, and I want to share that first so that we get some clarity here. So Mark shared, I am currently training for my first marathon. Congrats, Mark. Hope it goes well. He said, I am 53, have been running consistently for about 3 years now, mentioned kind of like about 1,500 miles a year, and a little before that as well, but certainly the last 3 years more consistently. I'm currently following the Hanson's Marathon Plan for Beginners. Okay, so many of you are familiar with Hanson's plans, and so that's one that some will be able to relate to as he shares. His goal is 350 for the marathon. And let me go back to first person from Mark. And I have been hitting the training criteria for the first time this time, he said, according to the plan. And then he made a funny comment about how Zach loves pace targets. I don't even know what you're talking about.
He's being facetious.
I've never heard of pace targets. What a strange phrase. I plan to run the Riverbank Run. That's a 25K this year, which is 2 weeks before the marathon. I have no intention of trying to run fast, so it's not a thought about like major goal race at the 25K. But love the race, want to participate, enjoy the social aspect, all that stuff. So this is now where the questions begin. The weekend before the Riverbank, the plan calls for a 16-mile run. And the weekend of Riverbank, the plan says 10-mile run. Riverbank is a 25K race. And so
it's about 15 miles.
So yes, thinking about that, then we start to ask two questions from Mark here. Should I run a little shorter distance the week before Riverbank? It says 16. He's asking, should I run 12-ish or something? So I'm not doing the same run 2 weeks in a row. Or will it not really matter? And then the second question, what are your thoughts on Riverbank's pace or effort specifically in that race itself, being 2 weeks before the marathon? So those two questions. Now that context all matters.
Yeah.
And here's why. Because the question about how long to go and how hard to go is entirely dependent on what you've been doing in training.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So now, understanding Hanson's, and especially understanding the Hanson's beginner marathon plan, we're talking about a marathon plan that has you doing long runs up to 16 miles, pretty much for the most part. You're not doing much longer than that. We already know from studying Hanson's that they believe that longer long runs in general are often detrimental, and so they very rarely recommend long runs beyond 16 miles for any marathoners. Certainly a strange thing in their readings, because then when you start to talk to their pro runners, they're all doing stuff way faster and longer than that. But that's
There's just so much nuance.
It's a different question.
So when
So
you're
much
just
nuance.
like generally advising people, they probably are going more towards the conservative end.
Certainly the plan you're going to buy in their book is going to suggest long runs that aren't quite as long as other things you find out there. So now part of the reason is because of the effort too. So their efforts on their long runs are not necessarily like super minimal or slow. You're doing efforts of more of a normal, if not faster or harder. So that's a question too. Now, Riverbank is a 15-mile race. So this is where it becomes important. 15 miles is very nearly the longest run that you're running, Mark, for the entire structure of this cycle. As a consequence, it has a significantly greater training effect and recovery need than if you say we're regularly running 20 or 22 miles. So the first answer here is it safe to run a 15-mile run 2 weeks before the marathon? Probably in this case, because you have been running long runs around that distance for a while, but only if the effort is low. So that's the initial thing. Like, can I cover the distance? Sure, fine. I don't think it's a problem. He asked if he should do it 2 weekends in a row, like 16 and then 15. And that goes back to it's probably fine in many instances because you're training for a marathon. It's probably a good thing to do that as long as the effort isn't too high, because you don't want to put yourself like you're running hard 2 weeks before a marathon for a long time. So then that is his second part of the question. So what kind of effort should I do? And in this instance, Mark, you got to go easy. 2 weeks before a marathon, your longest or very nearly your longest run of the schedule should not be a strong effort, almost of any kind. Now, as I was responding to Mark, we were discussing the nuance a little bit further, and my comment to him was, if you were adapted to running strong efforts of, like, let's say 12 or 13 miles, something close to this 25K, you've been doing a lot of that, and you've been doing long runs of 20 or 22 miles here and there, or let's say maybe not 20 or 22 miles, but you've been doing long runs of 16 to 18 miles regularly, then could you handle a 15-mile run at a little bit stronger effort? Yes. As long as it's not maximum effort. You can't be draining the well or anything. But 2 weeks is enough time to recover from a run that you're well adapted to, both in duration and effort. Not a run that you are not well adapted to.
A couple key things to consider in this question. One is that he knew which race he wanted to target as his goal race. That was crucial. So as you're thinking about your own process in deciding what to do for race efforts, consider that as well. So good job, Mark, knowing which one you wanted to highlight and knowing that it needed to be a priority, because having these kinds of conversations can't happen with your coach or looking at your own plans if you don't know what your goals are. Mark said he wanted to have fun. And, he wants to obviously gear towards whatever his marathon is. And he needs to be able to look at the riverbank run, that 25K, and say, how am I going to have a lot of fun, do a good job and feel good about this race, but still not risk anything in my goal race. So anyway, I thought that was a good consideration for Mark to be able to share that.
Excellent question, Mark. Appreciate that. And so questions like that, this is where, again, it comes back to, and this is why we ask you to share context. That specific detail that we had from Mark is what helps us respond to a question like that. You could have the exact same situation as Mark with different context surrounding it, and we would give you a different answer. So ask away.
Yeah, we love those kinds of questions.
Next up is from Amanda in Michigan.
Yes. So she wrote this to us. I feel like I hear a lot of great things that I should be doing while I'm already in the midst of training, and I'm not sure I should add any more new routines, and then I forget about it. I start off training for a new cycle because if your brain doesn't determine an urgent need for that information, it doesn't always stick. So what I'm understanding from what Amanda is saying, it's like I'm in the middle of the season. I hear all these great things, all these great routines, these strength things I should be doing, but I am drained in the middle of the season and I don't have the bandwidth to add something new on top of the load that I'm doing or the intensity I'm moving into. And then in the off season, not really seeing that as a time to start building, which that's what I'm going to tell you, Amanda. That is the best time to begin new routines, is when you are getting back into training, when the intensity and the volume is low, beginning out again, and you do have the energy to create those new habits.
I think she also was indicating that she's forgetting by the time she gets to that point, she has forgotten about those good things. So, of course, the first response there, Amanda, is your coach should definitely be helping you with that. And if you don't have a coach, no, I'm kidding. Well, I'm not kidding. But yes, these are the kinds of things where there's so much to have to keep in mind and try to have to create a sense of like ideal structures for every period of time. And that's what Andy's getting at. The best period of time for adding or adjusting routines, the best period of time for some of the ancillary work is, in fact, the downtime in between major training periods. And why is an important question there, Amanda, because you're asking the question as if I shouldn't probably make changes now. And you're probably right. If you're 4 weeks out from a race, or if you're right in the middle of a substantial training period, that's not generally a good time to change a lot of things. Maybe a few things, small things.
Small things. Or
just slowly injecting something new gradually is okay. But when we're trying to make those changes, we should be significant changes. We should be doing that during those in-between times.
Yeah, and there's two reasons for that.
Yes.
One is that you are developing these new habits, which do take more energy. And once they are habits, it takes less energy to actually do it, like mental energy. We talked about that in an episode, and all the science behind habits and forming these good habits. The second reason that you want to do them and start these new routines before is that when you're starting those foundations, you're building all those blocks that allow for you to do a healthy training cycle. So it is imperative actually to do your running correctly and to be firing correctly, so that when you begin your cycle, you start off on a great foot.
Exactly that. So, Amanda, your problem here is not that you don't know that there are things you could be doing. Your problem here is that you forget about them when you should be doing them, according to your question. So I would advise you very directly here to make note of any time you hear of something like, oh, that's something I think I need, or something that seems to be missing from my schedule. Make note of that and start to build for yourself. Have a single piece of paper, or digitally somewhere if you do digitally notes. Have a single spot where you're going to continue to make note of some of these things and build for yourself some clarity on, here's some stuff that I've noticed I'm missing over time, and here's when the best time to implement them. And then you'll also find, because Amanda, you clearly are one who attends to these things and wants to try to grow them, you're going to find that there's an infinite amount of things that you could be doing to address all of these, this stuff. You're going to constantly hear, and especially if you're on like something like Instagram, RPT often mentions, Adam Homolka mentions how you could, if you did it right, you could learn everything that you need to know to be a physical therapist by following a handful of people on Instagram. Because there's so much good information out there, right? His point is that people are sharing all this great detail and information. But you could follow one person on Instagram and find 100 different ways to do a leg strength routine from that one person.
It's overwhelming.
And now you've discovered the problem, which is I need to then prioritize what I do and how much of it I do, and things like that. So that's why I say keep track of this stuff, because then when it comes time to implement and adjust things, you're starting to build for yourself like a prioritized list of what I do and when I do it, especially with stuff that's not the running side, because that's hard to keep track of.
Yeah. And thank you, Amanda, for asking this question, because further in the message to me, you were saying that you thought maybe a lot of other runners could benefit from thinking about doing this before a goal season per se. So thank you for that insight, and then also bringing that to us.
Excellent. Well, the next one here is from Rob in Michigan. And Rob asking a question in particular about priorities in training. And we always like these kinds of questions. However, there's two ways to answer every kind of question like this. The first is like the general, here's what everyone should be thinking about. And we certainly are always happy to say that. But the second and the more important one is based off of your situation, your needs and goals, and the different nuances involved. we're naturally going to have to adjust this response. And so we're going to do two things, because Rob didn't give us a ton of context detail, but enough at least to give something practical here. And so the context, before Andi provides for us response, is training for the marathon. If we could give essentially what are the two most important runs of the week, what would they be?
Yeah. So we have to think about a couple things here. And we talk about these things a lot here at A to Z Running, but you need the musculoskeletal resilience. And so that is very, very important, meaning that your long run, it's not only for your aerobic fitness, but it's also important, that volume's important in order to build that musculoskeletal strength.
You don't want to break covering 26 miles. And naturally, for all of us, something breaks, because you're always breaking down, and that's a long distance to race. So you're going to experience breakdown, but you want to have as little of that as possible. And the thing that is going to create as little breakdown as possible, as far as the highest priority, is long run.
I loved on our episode about speed, strength, or endurance with Kate Grace, how she calls the time that they're building strength phase.
Well, it is, yes.
Because
system strength and leg strength.
Exactly. So thinking about what do you need to be able to run the marathon? Well, you have to be able to go the distance. That's number one. So your long runs are very important. You're getting a lot of adaptations from your long run. And then also steady state runs, I think, are imperative. You can do a lot with steady state runs.
And that being the kind of like sustained strong effort running over some given distance. Lydiard always recommended an hour for everyone, like regardless of your ability level. And I think that that's a good barometer to go by. Certainly there are times where you could do longer and shorter, but an hour is a good steady state run.
Yeah. So do you want to describe steady state?
Well, okay, sure. So
don't know.
this is one of those that it has left running vernacular more so in recent decades, but used to be just a very commonplace concept. And so a steady state is one of those vague terms. It's not a specific range of effort. It's a general range of effort. And what it is then is somewhere between, you're no longer running easy, but you're not running like race caliber effort. So if you were doing an hour race, which for many of us is somewhere between like 10K and 10 miles, it's somewhere in that window, right? So if you're doing an hour race effort, then steady state would have to be substantially easier than what you could do if you're going all out. Now, where we start to get into weird nuances is people often talk about steady state as if it's marathon race pace, which I don't know what that means. Race pace. That's what a weird term to say in training. No one trains by paces. That's crazy.
Again, he is being facetious.
But the point there is marathon race pace is a concept that exists in a moment in time, not in a training stimulus. And so it could exist in a training stimulus, but it shouldn't. And more specifically, you're not running a marathon when you're running an hour, and you're not in the same fitness in training that you want to be when you're racing your marathon later on. And so you shouldn't try to run a steady state run at a fixed pace based off a future goal. That doesn't make a lot of sense as far as trying to get the training stimulus that you want. So you do the steady state run based off of a sustained strong effort that's stronger than easy running, but certainly you could continue going longer than an hour. You're not maxing yourself out at an hour. The other thing here, and this is an important question because I just recently asked my coach Barry about this exact concept, because he was telling me to run a steady run at one point of an hour, and then shortly after that he was talking about running a steady run for 35 kilometers, which is going to take me a lot longer than an hour. And so that's about 22 miles. And so then he says, so I ask him, I'm like, okay, well, can you articulate for me, and this is not necessarily me asking because I didn't have an answer to it. It's me asking because I want to hear how Barry explains the answer to this. What's the difference in terms of how I should put out effort in those two runs? And his whole point was it's all based on the distance, or at least the duration, the time or the distance. And so steady effort for an hour is harder than steady effort for 22 miles. You can't run the same effort for both of those and have it be the same kind of training stimulus, obviously. So his answer was it depends on the duration, and that's how you apply it. So a steady effort has to be stronger than easy and slower than race caliber effort. And so race caliber effort for 22 miles is basically marathon effort, right? Because it's almost the same distance. And so a steady effort for 22 miles has to be slower than marathon. Has to be. Otherwise, it's not a steady effort by definition. But for an hour, it could be faster than marathon effort. It could be. Not to suggest that it is, because
It
again,
isn't for me.
it's a window. Right. Isn't
Just
that
put
just
that in perspective?
I love talking about this kind of
I
stuff in
know.
training, because it's just
Great.
not straightforward, and it's so valuable when we come to understand the heart of the thing we're trying to do, and we really feel like we can grasp that in training. Like, it's liberating as runners.
It is. And one of our goals at AtoZrunning, and one of the goals for our athletes, is to develop intuitive runners, because we think we can get the most out of ourselves when we become intuitive runners and understand why we are doing the things we are doing, how to listen and respond to our bodies and what it's telling us. So intuitive running, steady state grows that in us as we train doing steady efforts.
Indeed that. Now, back to Rob's question.
Yes.
So, Rob, you wanted to know for a marathon, the 2 most important runs of the week. Those 2 are, in fact, the most important runs of the week. As Lydiard used to say, we should just run long runs every day, except we can't. We'd break down. So, obviously, that point is that's the most important one for a marathoner. That's not necessarily true for other distances of races for all periods of training, and it's not necessarily true for every moment in your training cycle either. And the reason we say that is because, Rob, if you're 3 weeks out from your race, the marathon's no longer the long run's no longer the most important run of the week. So ask us in the specific context you're talking about. But in general, yes.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
And I do want to mention, too, that let's say those are the 2 things you want to focus on in a training cycle. Maybe you want to build cycle on cycle, and this is the first one that you're doing. And so you really want to hone in on raising that aerobic ceiling. Well, I also do think it's extremely important to inject that neuromuscular activity. So if you're doing fartleks or strides, or please do both. But I'm just saying in general, we need to be able to get that neuromuscular activation to be able to run properly and to engage properly, and then also doing those drills as well. So in addition to those 2 things.
So Andy's answer is everything.
But I mean, those are the 2 most important workouts. But if you could throw in strides and fartleks, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, and no one is likely asking us this question because they're only trying to run 2 days a week. I'm certainly not suggesting people don't only have time to run 2 days a week. But Rob's question is simply, if I have to make if I have to make sacrifices in a given week, what are the things I don't sacrifice as much as others? And that makes sense. Now, here's where the shtick hits, what Andy just said. So if I'm doing the same thing every week and I have to make the same sacrifice every week, now I change the answer, because if I am doing just long runs and steadies and I'm never doing any kind of neuromuscular work and fartleks and such, then I would say go every other week or maybe every 3rd week and take the steady out and do a fartlek instead. Because again, these things are not that straightforward. But we can get there. We can get there, Rob, with your long runs and your steady runs.
Absolutely.
All right. Now, the final question that we have time for today is more of kind of like a general question that we get a lot. There's a specific person asking it in this instance, but for the sake of like health privacy, we are not going to address that specific person's question. So this question from everyone or anonymous is training through illness. Naturally, because of COVID, many have been wondering about this in a more precise situation because can I even train through something like COVID? Should I? And all of those questions. So we've gotten that a lot from many of you, from some of our own athletes, in terms of like, if I have any kind of illness, how do I respond to that in my training? And so here's the way we answer this. And this is thoroughly nuanced. Once again, we do not claim to have studied COVID or its ramifications on running. And so as a consequence, don't take us as health authorities on anything we say.
Exactly.
But we do have some general perspectives that we want to apply in any of these kinds of situations. First,
and not just COVID, all sickness.
All sickness, right. First, if it's a respiratory illness, be very careful.
Be careful.
Because respiratory illnesses tend to worsen by hard activity. And it becomes harder to fight them off. And that's not true for all of them necessarily, but it seems to be the case as far as what we've observed and anything we've read about it. So if it's respiratory, especially if it's in your lungs and like it's coughing and things like that, or trouble breathing, some of that kind of stuff, be very careful about any kind of activity. The other side of this is if you're fighting any kind of virus, the early stages of the virus, when it's at its most virulent, is that the word that you use with viruses?
Viral.
Well, but yes, when it's replicating at its most aggressive state, and your body has not yet started to get a handle on that. rest is the most important thing. Rest and hydration
Rest.
are the most important things at that stage. And so if I have to like lose sleep to try to get a run in, don't do it. It doesn't matter if it's a severe virus or not. Give yourself a couple days to get extra rest, extra hydration, get all the good nutrition. That's really important. So anytime any of our runners say, hey, I'm not feeling so great, maybe take a couple days off. No matter what it is, just give yourself a couple days at least. Yeah. And then depending on what it is beyond that, it may, may change.
Like if it's feeling very mild or you're further along and you want to jog, that's great. But always consider that your body is having to fight this illness. And so if you put yourself under stress, it's just going to take you longer to recover. So easy running. You don't want to add further stress onto your system. That's going to make it harder for you to recover. But then also you're probably not going to get great adaptations either. So it's really not, it's not a winning situation. So jogging.
So that's the next kind of phase in the approach is if you can handle activity and it's not like, respiratory and you're just coughing terribly every time you try to move, then some light jogging of up to an hour, maybe, like duration and effort have to be low. Some very light jogging can in fact be recuperative depending on the nature of the illness. If you have influenza, I wouldn't do this while you're feverish and such. I wouldn't try to go out and jog. But there's a lot of conversation like, I've got this head cold and it's like this lingering sinus issue and it's not going away. A lot of the time, especially when it's something like sinuses, it can in fact help you feel better to do a little bit of light activity. So we know that can be the case, but at the same time, it has to be light, and we have to be able to monitor the degree of severity in our illness. And so we do recommend, as we're talking with runners in general of what they have, when you have mild symptoms of something and it's not worsened by activity, it's not like some kind of severe virus that is, potentially very dangerous. Then we tend to recommend a little bit of light activity. But you have to then respond to how you feel. So I go out and I do a 30-minute jog. This happened earlier when I was sick back in the winter. I went out and I did a 30-minute jog thinking, I'll just do some light jogging. I felt terrible afterward, like a bus had hit me in 30 minutes of light jogging. And keep in mind the nature of my training surrounding that was fairly substantial. So 30 minutes shouldn't have been hard for me at all. Now, because of that, I said, I need a couple days off.
Yeah.
I am not doing this again for a few days. So I took 4 days straight off. And the only reason I started jogging again after those 4 days is because I had an entire day where I felt basically normal. So then I said, okay, tomorrow I'll try to jog again. And I did, and I didn't feel badly after the jog anymore. As a matter of fact, I felt a little bit better after jogging than before, and that's what told me that it was good to try a little bit of light activity again. And each day that I did, I was feeling a little bit better, so I was moving in the right direction. Now, that all is dependent upon the individual situation.
Right.
So when we get the question like, I'm not feeling great, and so I gotta take some time off and everything, that's always the best initial thing. And then we kind of go from there.
Lots of considerations and great questions from all of you. We appreciate you reaching out with your training and running questions. So thanks.
Keep them coming.
Yes, please.
Because we're going to do this again in just a few weeks at the end of the next month. They're always the end of the month. And so if you've got a question on your mind, the best time to ask it is now so that you get yourself on the queue for the next time around. All right, now let's get on to the world of running. Well, before we get into the specifics of the world of running, let's talk about some A to Z runners performing well. Certainly at Rivertown Races, which was a series of different events. Thanks to Andrew and the crew for putting that on. We had a number of athletes performing there. Zach, namely, with a big PR, finishing 4th overall, which was... It took a significant final mile to catch a few people too. Just what a race! What a performance!
He was blazing.
It was awesome.
Finish. It was so fun to watch.
Big half marathon PR for Zach. Congrats, Zach. That's always really exciting. Nick won his age group in the 10K, 26th-ish overall. I wrote it down and then I'm like, I got to look that up again, and never did. So Nick, I know that it was 25th or 26th. I can't remember which one. So finishing in his first age group win that he's accomplished.
Congrats.
So congrats, Nick, on that too. Exciting stuff. Pete also ran, and it was not a day where he was trying to go all out, and so he just had a good, strong effort trying to be responsive to the day before a marathon coming up soon. So nice work, Pete. Always good to get those efforts in. And then in the trails side of the conversation, Kathy going out and storming the Hurt the Dirt trail race, finishing 4th in age group.
Yeah.
Congrats, Kathy. Trails are crazy, so glad you were able to endure that. And then at Glass City Marathon, Lewis paced, which is by itself something that always amazes me because, you've basically got to put the sign on your shoulders, kind of literally, and then be able to hold and help people out all around you. And so great for Lewis. Thank you for doing that for others as well.
And Zach also ran Rivertown races.
I did as well.
Mm-hmm.
And now let's talk about Yahuala.
Yahuala. She ran the fastest debut in the world's history in the marathon, and she ran a blazing 2:17:23 in Hamburg.
Wow.
That's a crazy debut.
So if you've never run a marathon before and you start thinking to yourself, I'm going to run a marathon, and then you wonder, I wonder how fast I can do it. She's the first person who started thinking, maybe I'll just run 2:17.
This does not come as a surprise, though. This was anticipated. We didn't know how fast she was going to go, but the world was kind of waiting to see what she was going to do in the marathon because she is the half marathon record holder.
No, second.
No? Second. I'm sorry.
Yep. But she would have been the record holder if not for Letesenbet Gide beating her in that same race.
Yep.
So she broke. That's why we always say it this way. She broke the previous world record, but she did it behind the person who won the race. So yes, having run the second fastest all time half marathon, but the record that Andy was trying to articulate there is the 10 kilometer.
Okay, so she has the 10 kilometer world record she did in 29:14. She had that in February, and her half marathon best is 1:03:51. So yes, second all time. So we were looking forward to seeing what Yahuala would do in the marathon, and this time is unbelievable.
Yeah.
All of the other marathoners should be shaking in their boots a little bit.
Well, so
they're racing shoes.
Well,
not their
probably
boots.
not racing in boots. So this is always really interesting. Any of the standard conversion calculators that you're going to use, if someone runs 29:14 and then 1:03:50, that person definitely can run 2:17 by just the objective measures. But we know that the marathon does not always produce the result that, quote, can be produced. And it goes both directions because you have plenty of marathoners like Bridget Koske, for example, who runs a super fast marathon, but doesn't necessarily have the times in shorter distances that match that marathon time. In case you're curious, another one is Eliud Kipchoge. His shorter distances are nowhere near the level of his marathon times. So as a consequence, is it because some people are more adapted to handling the marathon distance better than other people, and as a consequence it looks differently? But anyway, I'm only saying that because when people saw that she was finally going to run a marathon, everyone was like, she can definitely go fast, but
how fast?
You don't know exactly.
Yeah, and if the conditions would produce that too. The previous fastest ever women's marathon debut time was Paula Radcliffe in a time of 2:18:56.
Which is saying something because that was 20 years ago.
And she was the world record holder.
Yes.
So, I mean, Paula Radcliffe, to be able to hit her debut is great. She is breaking the stuff of legends. And that performance that Yahuala did this weekend was 6th on the women's world marathon all-time list. Mm-hmm. So let's remind you, Bridget Koske, she has the world record in 2:14:04 set in 2019.
Yep. Now, being 6th all time and yet 3rd fastest this year. So fast marathon times are happening, and they're happening quite a bit, but not usually on your first one.
Right. And that's why we do the World of Running segment, is because we are living in times where we're seeing these world records happen, and we want you to be part of that, the history in the making. Yeah.
Especially because, chances are the next time we're going to see a period like this is when some other substantial technology innovation happens. And so it's always exciting to be able to experience that when it's happening in real time. Well, speaking of some interesting, let's go to number 2 here, the outdoor track season. We've got a couple different things to articulate. And when we think about like outdoor track, and many of you being road runners, one of the things that we love so much about track is like that's the way to be able to spectate the full experience of running. Because road racing, you just don't get to, like, you can't see hardly anything.
You can't see the whole
when you're
thing.
watching races,
Yeah.
because either if you're spectating on the course, then you're really just seeing a couple of glimpses, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you're watching the live feed, you're seeing just the people in the front or occasional zoom outs with their drones or something. But the track, you see the whole race,
Mm-hmm.
every runner, and you get to kind of observe everything that's happening. And so that's part of why, as we start to talk about, like, we just love track so much, part of it is just being able to experience it in a more full sense. But anyway, let's get on, because the World Championships in track this summer are on United States soil. Is it for the first time?
Yeah,
I
for the first time.
I keep trying to remember.
It is,
For the
yes.
first time.
Hayward Field.
They've had the Olympics in the U.S., you know that, but the World Championships for World Athletics has never happened on U.S. soil. So Hayward Field, the new and improved, fully redesigned. It's going to be exciting.
Yes.
As a consequence, we really want to pay close attention to what people are doing on the track.
Yeah. And it really is just underway. This is the beginnings of the track season, so to speak.
Early days still.
Early
definitely.
days. Habs Kessler, who you know on this podcast, he was the fast high schooler, signed pro, lives in
Just
Michigan.
skipped the college career thing.
He
Just
trains
skipped
in Michigan with Nick Willis, and he made his outdoor debut at the Jesse Owens Classic. He ran strong, but was edged out by veteran Ben Flanagan. Hobbs ran 345.06 and Flanagan 344.98. So close race with the young guy and the
Very
veteran.
much edged out. Nice.
And
Okay.
then, we'll keep on the youngin' route and talk about collegiate Caitlin Toohey. She ran 1514.61 at the Virginia Classic.
Whoa.
That's 8th NCAA all time. Caitlin Toohey is one of those runners that was being watched under a microscope almost, because she's such a fast high schooler. Then coming into college, she has performed really well under high pressure and even has progressed in a way that it really has our eyes on her for, looking at who's going to be the best in the U.S. She's on her way there.
Well, and there was a lot of cynicism around her because, like with almost every great high school athlete, the first year of college tends to be a bit of a kind of shakeup.
Adjustment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, like, people were like, "Oh, she's just not performing to expectations." It's like, what
Give
are
her
your
some
expectations?
space.
Are you crazy?
What were you doing at 18 years old?
Oh goodness. Yeah. Well. So
Yeah.
anyway, but she's been there though. She's been dialed in. Maybe she wasn't improving the way people kept saying she should have been, but
Now she is.
clearly
yeah.
they were just.
And this is very typical. Changing coaches, changing how you train
Environments.
takes a while to see the fruition of that work. And then Athing Mo, she ran the 800, first time since 2021 pre-classic. She ran 2:02.07. And people are like giving her a hard time. But the fact of the matter is, it's very early, first of all. She won by over 3 seconds.
Yeah.
So she didn't have pressure at the end. So it's not a concern.
No, not at all. I mean, listen, if I'm Athing Mo's coach, I'm telling her to not go crazy right now in races at all. Specifically, like, just run hard and feel comfortable. And so for a world-class 800 runner to run 2:02 in what is definitely not an all-out effort, there's no way she's trying to run all out in April.
And win.
So
And
and
she's
win
winning
by
by
3
3 seconds.
So like, yeah, that's actually a really good sign.
Yeah.
That she can just show up and do that in a pretty low-key effort. I'm good for that. Yep.
Yeah. And the reason why we bring it up again is to help us understand what goes on in the sport of track and to keep you updated with insights. Well, there's more on track. The Oregon Relays happened this past weekend. And you know how we love the steeplechase here on the AtoZrunning Podcast.
We do.
Mason Frerick ran the third all-time in the world this year in the 3,000 meters. I'm having a hard time speaking.
The
3,000
steeplechase. We'll just
meter
go there.
steeplechase in a time of 8:23.92. So that's a really
stuff.
great opener.
Yeah. Now, once again, people were trying to cast shade because they're like, number 3 in the world in April. That doesn't mean anything. Most people haven't raced yet. And of course, it doesn't mean anything like in terms of the grand scheme of track and field, but it's pretty impressive to open up in an 8:23 anyway. So take aside the number 3 in the world thing. That was a great performance by Mason. And he's
absolutely.
definitely feeling good about it too. There's no doubt about that.
And his
That's
last
a
name's
confidence
Furlick.
boost.
I was just totally
Trying to
tongue-tied.
go with Courtney there for a moment. Furlick.
Yeah.
So yes, now. the last one here.
This is really interesting.
This is really interesting. Now, I wanted to give some context before, and I'm actually giving a little bit of a spoiler here. But we mentioned like record-breaking times these days in running, and that certainly is true, especially, as it were, in distance stuff. But one of the interesting things is that occasionally you come across something that has been around for like 40, 50 years, and people are like, wait, hang on a second. How has no one broken that record? Like, it's just an interesting reflection how it's just, that's still there somehow. And yet, it doesn't mean it's easy to break a record just because it's 40 years old. And this is a good example of that.
So some pro Oregon runners went for the 4-by-mile record.
All right. This is one of my favorite things. The 4-by-mile relay is awesome, but it takes 4 world-class people.
World-class.
Running world-class performance at the same time on a team.
Yeah.
In order to put things together here.
So it was Cooper Tier, Cole Hawker, James West, and Matthew Weisner, and they attempted to run faster than 15 minutes, 49 seconds. And that was set, like Zach alluded to, way back when in Ireland in 1985.
In Ireland, which, you know, so
Ireland,
like it's
in 1985. Do you want me to say that again? To just kind of like wrap your brain around it. And
So
we've had so many great runners in history, you know, since then, but that was
all
the
over the
fastest
world,
4-by-mile time.
well, that's just it. So 15:49 means that the runners are averaging 357 and change for all 4 of them, because they've got to shave 11 seconds off of the 4-minute average. And so as a consequence, you think, can we get 4 people who can run 357? Yeah, there's definitely 4 people. Can you get them to do it at the same time on the same day?
Yeah.
And willing to do it like as a team. And that's why it's just a very rare thing to see happen. Yeah. Well, these guys can.
Yeah.
Certainly they're capable.
This weekend.
But they missed it.
Unfortunately.
Barely.
Yeah, they ran the second fastest time ever in the history of the world as a team in 15:52.05. But here's kind of like the sad news of it. Even if they would have been successful, it wouldn't have been official because they're not all from the same country.
And once again, we get into what makes these things difficult. So, in fact, to be given a record in order to be called a relay team, you have to be of the same country.
So they're from, you know, they're from Great Britain, and they're
3 out of the
Americans.
4. 3 out of the 4 were U.S., but certainly. And so why did they do it in the first place? Well, because it's fun.
And they're, I think they're all Ducks.
Well, they're all from Oregon.
Yeah,
so,
former Oregon.
Yeah, that helps. It's just a cool thing.
Kind of cool. Yeah. Kind of cool they could do it together.
Side note, and an interesting fact, when things just go full circle, the agent who represents both Cooper Tier and Cole Hawker also happens to be one of the Irish of the 1985 world record team.
Mm-hmm. So that's Ray Flynn.
Ray Flynn is their agent and also was on that team. So it's just kind of funny where it's like, okay, so clearly there was some just interest in, hey, let's see if we can do this thing.
Mm-hmm. So I didn't realize this, but all of them are coached by associate head coach Ben Thomas
at Oregon.
Oregon.
All right.
And he brought the idea of taking on this shot at the world record about 2 weeks ago.
Only 2 weeks ago. So he's like thinking to himself, you know, maybe in a couple weeks you guys should all just run super fast on the track in this race. I mean,
if they were to do this later, it just would be it would be harder to make their schedules work together in that way, because we're going to be getting into a season of racing where they're looking at world championships. So I'm guessing this would have been like a kickoff to a great season here, and it still was, just not with the time that they were hoping for.
Side note.
Another side note.
Cooper Tier attempted to put the team on his back in the anchor leg, having taken the baton with clearly time over what they needed, and threw down a 3:53, which is not nasty. That far off of his PR. So he's out there just cranking, seeing if he can't salvage it for him. Great work, Cooper and company.
Yeah, and company.
Great.
They all did great. Yeah. Well, that's it for the world of running. There's so much more we could cover. That's why every week we talk about the latest that's going on in the world of running, keeping you up to date.
And certainly with that, always remember that we are doing what we can to be helpful to you. And so that's why the questions are important. That's why we love it when you get involved and putting comments on things, sharing your thoughts and experiences and insights so that we can, in return, share them with our audience. And with all of that, if you have not yet found enough in the information provided to get you where you need to go, then let's talk a little more, because we would love to certainly support you in ways that can help you further. You can find all of that information at AtoZrunning.com. Look for the word coaching, or just reach out and send us a note.
We're so glad you've joined us again on the A to Z Running Podcast. Wherever you are running or wherever you are driving, wherever you are putting us in your ears, we consider it a privilege to be part of your day. So thanks so much for watching or listening, and have a great week.